Hi, welcome back. Let's talk about carb counting. I'm really excited about this one. I like carb counting. First of all, let's discuss sources of carbohydrate. We have to know what foods contain carb before we can start counting them. The major food groups that contain carbohydrate are starches, fruits, milks, and yogurt. Other carbohydrates and non-starchy vegetables. Cheese is not in the carbohydrate category. It's actually a protein and is lumped in with your meat and other proteins. And fats do not contain carbohydrate and will not affect or directly affect the blood sugar either. So when I teach patients about carbs, I pretty much tell them every food contains carbohydrate except meats and fats. One serving of a carbohydrate containing food usually contains about 80 calories and roughly 15 grams of carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are good sources of B vitamins, and some choices are a good source of fiber as well. And some examples of a bread or a starch would include like a half a cup of cooked cereal, such as oatmeal or cream of wheat, 3/4 cup of unsweetened cold cereal, a half a cup of peas or corn or potatoes, a slice of bread, 6 crackers, 1/3 cup cooked pasta, or 1 brown and serve roll. And that would be a small brown and serve roll, not one of your bigger ones. Fruits, a serving size usually contains about 60 calories and 15 grams of carbohydrate. Fruits are a good source of free fructose, and foods in this category include your fresh fruits, cooked, dried, frozen, canned, and fruit juices. I recommend that my patients with diabetes decrease the amount of fruit juice in their diet because they are eliminating a lot of fiber and vitamins and minerals when they are drinking more juice than eating, fresh fruit. And so I ask them to stop the juice and start eating more of the fruit itself. Serving sizes of fruit. About a half a cup of most fruits is a serving size. So 4 ounces of juice or a small juice glass, a half a cup of canned fruit. And I recommend that canned fruit is packed in water or light syrup because that will contain less carbohydrate than your fruits packed in heavy syrup. A small piece of fruit would be about the size of a tennis ball if you're looking at portion sizes. Melons and berries have more water in them, and so a cup of a melon would be considered a serving size. And then 2 tablespoons to 1/4 cup of dried fruit, such as raisins, because the water has been removed from that type of fruit and the carbohydrate is more concentrated. That's why the portion size is smaller. The milk and yogurt group, one serving would be about 12 grams of carbohydrate. Calories vary by fat content. I would recommend fat-free and non-fat yogurt. A good source of calcium, protein, and vitamin D in your dairy products. A portion size for milk is about 1 cup or 8 ounces. For your yogurt, it's about 6 ounces or 1 small container. It is recommended that patients buy the light yogurt because it's usually artificially sweetened and has less carbohydrate in it. This group includes your fat-free milks, all the way up to 4%, and that's where a lot of patients get confused. They get the fat content in milk confused with the carbohydrate content, and so they think by going from 4% fat to skim milk that they're also getting less carbohydrate, and that's not the case. The carbohydrate remains the same. It's the fat that's being lowered. And a lot of times I have to explain that to patients. Buttermilk, soy milk, lactose-free milk, dry milk, those have the same amount of carbohydrate and calories, usually per serving, as your other milks do. Evaporated milk, about a half a cup is a portion size for that. Sweets, desserts, and other carbohydrates. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes with these particular foods. A serving of this group is about 15 grams of carbohydrate. Calories do vary based on the fat content. Typically, the higher the fat content, the higher the calories. This group does not include any important vitamins and minerals and includes foods such as ice cream, potato chips, cookies, sherbet, things like that. Sugar-free does not mean carbohydrate-free, and I talked about in the previous presentation, that our patients need to be made aware that sugar-free foods still have an effect on blood glucose levels. And fat-free may contain extra carbohydrates. So if the label says fat-free, a lot of times there's been extra sugar added to the product to compensate for flavor. A serving size of this group equals about a half a cup of ice cream, a 2-inch square brownie unfrosted, a tablespoon of honey or sugar, 5 vanilla wafers, 1 to 2 cookies, half a cup of sugar-free pudding, 5 candy kisses would be a serving size. And really, when you look at ice cream, there's not much carbohydrate difference between like your ice cream and your frozen yogurt. The difference is the fat content in the product. And it's important you compare food labels when you're looking at these types of products. Non-starchy vegetables do not have as much carbohydrate in them. One serving usually equals about 5 grams of carbohydrate and 25 calories. These foods are a good source of fiber and antioxidants. So a serving size equals a half a cup if it's cooked, 1 cup if it's raw, and includes things like green beans, broccoli, carrot, celery, cucumbers, etc. When I teach patients this, I always tell them you're usually the foods your kids or your grandkids don't want to eat a lot of times, or what we call rabbit food or garden vegetables are in this group. Combination foods are difficult for people, and I think that's what makes going out to eat difficult as well. And most of the time, these types of foods are usually high fat and high carbohydrate and include things like pizza, Chinese food, movie popcorn with butter, burgers and fries, buffets, holiday meals, things like that. And oftentimes people will have questions for me about what to do if they have, grandma's recipe for a particular item at home. And I mean, there's no easy solution. They're going to have to work. They're going to have to count the carbohydrate and all of the ingredients to figure out the carbohydrate per serving in the product. But I make sure they understand that if they do it once, they need to write it down on their recipe, and they'll never have to go back and do that again when they're the next time they make that product and need to know the carbohydrate content. Combination foods, a serving equals 15 grams of carbohydrate. The fat, protein, and carbohydrates vary in these foods, and food items usually have more than 400 milligrams of sodium per serving. Combination foods can also include like tuna noodle casserole, macaroni and cheese, spaghetti, chili, hamburger helper. Frozen TV dinners usually contain about 15 to 30 grams of carbs. Soups, a cup with broth, usually about 15 grams of carbs. Pizza, 1/4 of a frozen pizza is about 30 grams of carbohydrate. And it depends. Is it a thick crust or is it a thin crust? Stews, a cup is about 30 grams of carbs. So as you can see, the carbohydrates in combination foods vary, and it's important in someone who is carbohydrate counting or basing their insulin dose off of the amount of carbohydrate they're eating, that they have resources that they need when they go out to eat to be able to count their carbs correctly, such as a Calorie King book or a smartphone app they can download on their smartphone to help them figure out the carbohydrates they're consuming. So, what are the benefits of carbohydrate counting? Carbohydrate counting has a lot of benefits. It does help to stabilize blood glucose levels, and can be combined with a healthful eating pattern. You can be on a Mediterranean diet and count your carbohydrates too. It doesn't affect your Mediterranean diet. It gives more flexibility to enjoy all foods. I never would tell my patients with diabetes that they could never have a piece of birthday cake again. That's not a reasonable request of them, and something that they're not going to be compliant with anyway. And so the best thing, or the good thing about carb counting, is we can teach them how to work in some of those foods without it having too much of an effect on their blood glucose control. And then what's made life a lot easier for people who carbohydrate count is the food label, because the carbohydrates are right there in front of them. And I'll say it again, I know I've said it a lot, but healthy eating is an important part of carbohydrate counting. Again, we need to stress more whole wheat pastas, breads, grains, and fruits, and more fiber in the diet. We also need to pay attention to dairy products and make sure we're teaching low-fat dairy products for heart health. And I thought I'd mention this. High fiber foods, let me go back to that slide. High fiber foods can break down more slowly and actually can cause blood glucose levels to rise more slowly. They can have a beneficial effect on blood sugar control. Okay, so there are two ways to count carbohydrates. You can either do it by carb choices or count the actual grams of carbohydrate. I like to teach carb counting in grams, especially if I've got someone who's using an insulin to carbohydrate ratio, because they have to convert their carb to grams in order to use a ratio, or it's easier for them to use the ratio if the carbs are counted in gram form. But either way is okay. Choices seem to be an easier concept for some people, especially elderly people. If you can tell them or teach them portion size and then just say you can have 3 carbohydrate food choices at each meal, that seems to be an easier concept than having them count the grams of carbohydrate. But either way is fine. 1 carb choice equals 15 grams of carbohydrate. You need to remember that number because you'll still see carb choices used. When you're using grams of carbohydrate, you would add up the total grams of carb for all your foods and just total that. So, why, when you're looking at carbohydrate counting, you want to make sure you don't, or that you prevent carbohydrate guessing, because what carbohydrate guessing leads to is uncontrolled blood sugar. I find that the people who make, in my experience, who are making the biggest mistakes with carb counting are the people who've been doing it the longest. And I think it's because they become pretty confident that they know or understand how much carbohydrates in the food that they're eating, and they stop looking. They stop relying on their food label information or in their Calorie King book on that information to count their carbs. And over time, they get less and less accurate with their carb counting. And so it's even important for people using insulin pumps and insulin to carb ratios to get regular follow-up with their dietitian and a review of carb counting, because they do need that refresher. It's also important for people to understand that to accurately carb count, they have to know their portion sizes. And for a while, that means probably getting out their measuring cups and measuring the food that they're eating so that they know exactly what 1 cup or 1/2 cup of a food looks like. And then, I tell my pump patients, do that once a week. Just pick a meal every week and do it. And it seems to instill in them or keep them from getting off course with their portion sizes. And then use references. Calorie King book is a go-to book for people who carbohydrate count, and it's a great book. It's got restaurants in it and every food you could buy at the grocery store in that book. And Calorie King also has a smartphone app that my patients really like to use. That I've heard better things about that than about any other carb counting app I've recommended to people. But there's still the food exchange list for diabetes. There's websites they can go to. And then there's the food label. And the food label does provide very accurate information. So, I think we live in a day and age where it's easier to get your carbohydrate information than it ever has been, actually. So when measuring food portions, the thing to remember that's important about knowing your portion sizes is it does have to provide a frame of reference when you go out to eat. If you can learn by measuring your food at home what 1 cup or 1/2 cup looks like, then when you go out to eat, you'll be able to look at what's on your plate and make a pretty good educated decision about how much carbohydrate you're getting based on the serving sizes that the restaurant is providing you. And, restaurants provide servings that are a lot bigger than what we need or what's recommended for us. So, I like to use visuals to teach people too about portion control. Most people don't need any more than 3 or 4 ounces of meat at a meal, and that's the size of a deck of cards. Or using your fist as a reference to determine a 1 cup portion size. A light bulb would be about the same as a 6 ounce portion size. A large egg would be about 1/3 of a cup, and so on and so forth. But I think it helps patients have those little references to go by whenever they're learning portion control. And then like a small serving of fruit, like an apple, you would want to be about the size of a tennis ball. I got apples at Sam's the other day that you could put 2 tennis balls together, and the apple's bigger than that even. And so it's important that people learn this stuff so that they can make better choices about their carbohydrates and their portion control. The plate method is a really good thing to use to teach portion control and well-balanced diet, and is my go-to education tool for teaching people who have health literacy issues and the elderly, because it provides a visual for them and it's less stressful, I think, for them to learn how to do. Basically, the half of your plate should be full of garden vegetables. Tomatoes, green leafy vegetables, carrots, things like that. Only about 1/4 of the plate should be meat, and then 1/4 of your plate could be starch. So, and that includes a starchy vegetable. So, the potato, bread, whatever it is you have as a starch at that meal should only take up 1/4 of a 9-inch dinner plate. And then you need a dairy with every meal, so an 8-ounce glass of milk and a fruit with every meal in order for it to be considered well balanced. So when you want to use the plate method to count carbohydrates, it makes it pretty easy if you know your portion sizes. So you know that your meat contains 0 grams of carbohydrate. If you've got corn on your plate and it's taking up about 1/4 of your plate, that's about 15 grams. Your vegetables would be about 15. Your milk 12, your sugar-free applesauce up in the right-hand corner would be about 15 as well. So there's a total of 57 grams of carbohydrate on this example, or that would be the same as 4 choices. And so that's a pretty easy way to help people understand carbohydrate counting. Snacks may be a part of a meal plan. I think with the older insulins like N and R, it was important to teach people to snack in between meals or snack at bedtime. Now that we have Lantus, Levemir, and our rapid acting insulins, it's less important that people bring snacks or have snacks because these insulins tend not to cause as much low blood sugar. And in fact, a bedtime snack for most people who are on Lantus and rapid acting insulin, I don't recommend bedtime snacks for anymore because they're not having problems with nocturnal hypoglycemia. And I found over the years that if they're eating a bedtime snack, they're gaining weight. It's causing them to eat more calories than what they need. So if I can, or if I feel like it's safe for the patient not to snack between their meals, not to have a bedtime snack, I would advise that. But snacks usually need to be between 15 and 30 grams of carbohydrate. Some people may still need a bedtime snack even if they're on Lantus. I think it's just individualized. I still recommend the bedtime snacks for people on mixed insulins, people on insulin secretagogue medications, things like that. And your bedtime snack should be starchy because it takes longer to metabolize. So, bread, cracker, cereal, popcorn, those would be good examples of a good bedtime snack for patients. So this slide just gives you some examples of some snack options. There's not really much of anything healthy on here, but people with diabetes can have the examples listed. Half a cup of pudding would be 30 grams of carb. If you did the sugar-free pudding, that would cut it down to about 12 to 15 grams of carb per serving. 3 cups of popcorn, 3/4 ounce of pretzels, etc. Fiber and sugar alcohols. Fiber is more slowly digested, and some of it cannot be digested. So if a product has more than 5 grams of fiber per serving in it, I recommend subtracting half the fiber grams from the total carbohydrate grams in the product when determining an insulin dose. The same thing with sugar alcohol. Subtract half of the sugar alcohol grams from the total carbohydrate grams as well, because sugar alcohol also some of it is not digested or absorbed. So, for example, when you're reading food labels to determine the amount of carbohydrate, you want to look at your serving size first. So in this particular example, the serving size is 1 cup. And then you want to look or focus first on your total carbohydrate grams. And I teach people that it's not necessary to look at the sugar because that's already calculated into your total carbohydrate. So look at your total carbohydrate grams and notice in this example that dietary fiber, there's 10 grams of dietary fiber in this product. And so what's recommended is taking half of the dietary fiber and subtracting it from the total carb. And so the amount of carbohydrate to count would be about 25 grams of carbohydrate. And so when a person is using an insulin to carbohydrate ratio, they would base their insulin dose on eating 25 grams of carbohydrate instead of the 30 grams listed on the food label. So for example, let's say that the doctor has prescribed 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin, such as Humalog or Novolog or Apidra, for every carbohydrate choice. And the patient has 3/4 cup of cereal, a half of a banana, and 1 cup of milk. So there are 3 carb choices in front of us. And if you want to use carb choices to determine an insulin dose, then the patient will get 1 unit for every carb choice, that means the patient will need 3 units of rapid-acting insulin to cover the food that they're eating. To calculate an insulin dose by counting grams of carbohydrates, if a doctor prescribes 1 unit of insulin for every 15 grams of carbohydrate, then you would count up just the total grams of carbohydrate in the meal. So in this example, the total carbohydrate grams is 60, and then divide the 60 by 15, or the big number in your ratio, and the total units of insulin needed would be 4 units. So how do you know if you're carbohydrate counting correctly? And I always recommend to people who are using basal bolus insulin therapy that they check their blood glucose before meals and occasionally 1 to 2 hours after meals. Because by testing before the meal, that shows if their basal insulin or long-acting insulin is sufficiently dosed. And then by testing a before and after meal, you can compare those two numbers to see how the different amounts of carbohydrate and the insulin, the rapid-acting insulin dose at the meal, is affecting the blood glucose level. And just as a reminder, the ADA goals for before meal glucoses are 70 to 130 and then less than 180, 1 to 2 hours after meals. So if the blood glucose is too high after a meal, that could mean a couple of things. It could mean either the patient ate too many carbohydrates, or that the insulin dose wasn't dosed properly. If the blood glucose is too low, they probably didn't eat enough carbohydrates to support that insulin dose. So it's important to remind patients to check their portion sizes and make sure they're reading their food labels properly. Also, the rate of digestion or absorption of certain carbohydrates does make a difference. Simple sugars, such as those found in sugar-sweetened beverages, are digested and absorbed in 15 to 30 minutes. Well, a rapid-acting insulin doesn't peak until it's been in the body for about an hour, whereas complex carbohydrates take 1 to 1.5 hours or more to digest and absorb. Fat and protein take several hours or can prolong the absorption of the carbohydrates at the meal. And so can, in the long run, cause higher blood sugars, not directly, but by delaying the absorption of the carbohydrate you ate with it. It is important to keep records because that will help the patient recall the different foods and how those foods affected blood glucose levels, because certain foods have individual effects. I have some patients that can eat a banana and their blood sugar stays pretty stable. I have other patients who eat a banana and their blood sugar, goes to 300. So each food kind of has an individual effect on the patient, and they need to know, and over time we'll figure out the foods that tend to raise their blood sugar more than others, especially if they're testing their blood glucoses as they should be. Many blood glucose record books have a place to keep food records. I like to use a logbook provided by Lilly, the company that makes Humalog, because there's a place for documenting not only blood glucose results, but insulin that was given, and a place to document or keep a food diary. Some tools to use to count carbohydrates. The ADA's Choose Your Foods is a good one. Bows and Churches is a book you can buy that has a lot of foods broken down. I've already talked about the Calorie King book. And then the ADA also has a restaurant guide that you can access, I believe, from their website. That concludes our discussion about basic carbohydrate counting. I hope you learned a lot from our discussion about meal planning today, and I look forward to speaking with you again in Module 4.